Um, Good morning and welcome back to the Maison Française. My name is Pierre. I'm a professor in the Department of French here at Columbia. And I've been asked to introduce this entire day. I won't be long, but I would like to take advantage of being at the podium in order to briefly explain how Bachir joined the faculty at Columbia. And in order to account for this, one has to go back 50 years. Uh, so Bachir and I have been friends for almost 50 years. I calculated this morning, so it's about 49 years to be precise. And when we first met in September 1976, I was 18 and Bachir was 21. We were both students in the preparatory classes at the Lycée Louis-le-Grand, studying for the entrance exam to the École Normale Supérieure. Bachir brilliantly succeeded at the end of that academic year. In 1977, he ranked second in Normalien slang, that was vice-cacique. So he ranked second on the competitive nationwide examination to enter the École Normale Supérieure. So Bachir and I met again at the École Normale Supérieure after I joined the school myself the following year in 1978. He spent the following year at Harvard, and we met again upon his return from the US. I left from Mexico in 1981 to fulfill my French National Service obligation as a teacher at the French Institute. Bachir returned to Senegal in 1982 to teach philosophy at Cheikh Anta Diop University in Dakar, having obtained his first doctorate on the algebra of logic. We lost touch for nearly 20 years. Bachir continued to teach at Cheikh Anta Diop University, where he became a full professor in 1993. I began an academic career in the US. During that period, I learned from a mutual friend who is now a professor at UC Santa Barbara that Bachir got married. And this friend used to say that Bachir spoke about his young wife as the heroes in the Iliad do. And I saw Bachir also in a documentary made for the bicentennial of the founding of the École Normale Supérieure in 1994. So he was interviewed for that documentary, and I saw him on television. It was one day in 1999, or perhaps 2000, that I saw Bachir again. He had knocked on my office door at Columbia. And we spoke as if we had parted ways the day before. He explained that he would now be coming to Chicago regularly as a visiting professor at Northwestern. At the time, I was chair of the French department. In 2001, so 1 year later, or a couple of years later, the Francophone literature professorship at Columbia was vacant. Nasrin Qader, who had been its first holder, having decided to retire. I immediately thought of Bachir for the position and wrote to him to invite him to apply. He replied that the position would have greatly interested him, but that he was already committed to Northwestern, having accepted a tenured position as professor of philosophy and religious studies. Any American academic well-versed in the practices of professional negotiation, would have taken advantage of this opportunity to attract two competing offers and raise the stakes. Bachir did not see it that way. He had given his words to his colleagues at Northwestern, and there was no going back on that. So I wished him luck in his new life in Chicago, which began in the fall of 2002. After this missed opportunity with Columbia, another opportunity presented itself. In 2005, following numerous retirements, while I was serving my third and final term as chair of the French department, I obtained permission from the dean of the faculty to conduct a cluster search and to rebuild the French department as a place of research and teaching at the crossroads of several disciplines. Several of the professors recruited on this occasion had a multidisciplinary profile and saw their disciplinary expertise acknowledged by a joint position between the French department and another department on campus. For instance, Emmanuel Sada in French and in history. Bachir's intellectual profile was particularly attractive in this context, and the range of his skills was dazzling. He could teach the history of logic, the philosophy of science, the relationship between philosophy and Islam, Francophone literature, and African philosophy. He was offered a joint position, 3/4 in French, 1/4 in philosophy, and he officially joined the Columbia faculty in January 2008. And the rest is history. There will be 3 panels today, and I will announce them in reverse chronological order. So it will be, well, panels 5, 6, and 7. So panel 7, where I will actually say a few words about our friendship going back 50 years. So panel 7 will be chaired by Emmanuel Sada, who is a professor of French and history and currently the chair of the French department. So panel 6 was going to be chaired by Christian Mercer, who is the Gustav Bern Professor of Philosophy, but Christia is sick, so Emmanuel has agreed to chair in her stead. I hope Emmanuel is aware of this. And we will begin now with panel 5, who will be chaired by Mamadou Diouf, who is the Leitner Professor of African Studies. He is a member of the Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies department, and also of the History department. So, Mamadou, you have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Pierre. And thank you to all of you for being present in this panel 5 at this conference in honor. I have never been able to say what Bachir represents for me. And you will see at the panel what he represents. Is he a friend? Is he a colleague? Is he my cousin? All those things actually have contributed to the kind of relationship I have developed with him. And just yesterday, I was talking with Bado, and he reminded me that when he came to ask Bachir to be his supervisor, Bachir was in my office, and it was in Dakar a very, very long time ago. So this panel 5 will be animated by 4 colleagues who will be engaging with Bachir scholarship all of them are also Bachir friends. And we'll begin with Anai, who is an assistant professor of French and comparative literature at Rutgers University. Her research explores indigenous decolonial ecology with a focus on nuclear imperialism and climate change. Her first monograph, The Ocean on Fire, Pacific Stories from Nuclear Survivor to Climate Activists, was released in 2024. And she will talk about Ensemble, Habiter la Terre, environmental perspective on negritude and oceanitude. And her paper will be in English. So welcome, Anai.
Hello, everyone. Yaurana, Professor Souleymane Bachir Diagne, Pierre, Fanny Gex, everyone at the Maison Française, thank you. I'm so truly grateful for the opportunity to be here today. Thank you so much for inviting me for this incredible opportunity to share my gratitude and admiration for Souleymane Bachir Diagne, who was my advisor when I was a graduate student here at Columbia University. I want to, after thanking everyone, I want to apologize for not being able to stay for the whole day because of a family emergency, which prevents me from dedicating as much time as I would have loved to this event. But on a personal note, I want to say that in those hard times where a close family member of mine is between life and death, it's really important for me to return to the work of Souleymane Bachir Diagne and his writings on the force vitale and the élan vital that is within all of us. So, as I said, Bachir was my dissertation advisor alongside with Madeleine Doby, because really it takes a village to raise a graduate student, just like it takes a village to raise a baby. But today I will focus on Bachir's contribution because he so generously agreed to support my work. I work on the Pacific Ocean, which is somewhat far from Bachir's native Senegal. And as Salim mentioned yesterday, I moved to France after high school, and in France it was impossible to find someone who would agree to direct research on this topic. I was told in no ambiguous terms by everyone I asked, there is no such thing as Pacific literature in French. Bachir, however, said, I don't know much about Pacific literature in French, but I will gladly supervise your project. And Tahiti, the island where I grew up, is 12 hours away from St. Louis. But Bachir's work on negritude, and particularly his writings on Bergson, Senghor, and Césaire, resonate with the field of Pacific environmental studies in general, and for my work on Pacific theories of identities in particular. And this can be seen, I think, as an additional proof of the universal scope of his work, because what he writes about any region of the world can illuminate and invigorate philosophical thought and literary analysis on the other side of the planet. So I work on environmental philosophy in a region of the world that's literally at the margins of most maps. I don't know how to change. Where do I point? Yeah. It's this one? Thank you. Okay. So on most maps, the Pacific Ocean is split in half and literally relegated to the margins of the world. Most maps in textbooks, for example, don't even figure the names of Pacific islands and the geographical outline of Pacific islands. The Pacific is studied primarily by archaeologists and anthropologists, and it's seen as a region outside of modernity. And yet, these islands are at the center of contemporary geopolitical dynamics. As we were reminded yesterday, the nuclear issue looms over all of us, but in the Pacific, the nuclear apocalypse started in 1945. The Pacific is where Western nations, the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, tested the vast majority of their nuclear and all of their thermonuclear weapons between 1946 and 1996. Together, they unleashed upon Pacific Islands the destructive yield equivalent of one Hiroshima bomb a day, every day, for half a century. Today, the Pacific is still at the forefront of the military buildup between the United States and China, and of course, it is on the front lines of global climate collapse, as rising sea levels simply threaten to engulf many low-lying island countries. There is an urgent need to reverse the mainstream conceptual framework that puts Oceania at the margins and restricts Pacific scholarship to the study of its history, because Pacific people were some of the first to enter modernity, to be subjected to biopolitical modes of governance, to live in the Anthropocene. And the Pacific deserves to be studied by philosophers, literary scholars, and geopolitical experts as a region at the forefront of 21st century issues. To counter the marginalization of these islands in mainstream discourse, Pacific writers and artists offer a counter-hegemonic vision of Oceania. This other ideology is the philosophy of oceanitude, a neologism coined by Nivanuatu writer Paul Takaotavo in his novel Quand le cannibale ricane, when the cannibal sneers. The word appears twice in his novel. He writes, Écoutons, lisons maintenant de l'océanitude. Henri Hiro, Chantal Spitz, Dewey Gorodé, Grace Molissa et tous les autres qui nous montrent le chemin de l'importance du vivre ensemble. Notre océanitude une fois conquise, plus jamais ne sera soumise. So in this brief talk, I want to outline the genealogy of oceanitude and its relationship with negritude, the aesthetics of oceanitude and how they complement the aesthetics of negritude, and show that its philosophy really embodies what Bachir has defined as a new universal. So going from the Pacific to the Black Atlantic, it's obvious that Tavo chose to call his literary, political, and philosophical movement Océanitude instead of Océanité or Océanisme for its obvious homophony with negritude. And to understand Océanitude, we must go back to the roots of negritude. Because one of negritude's most notable legacies, and the one that interests Bashir's a lot, it's critique of analytical, mechanical, Cartesian modes of analysis. Because Cartesian reasoning, according to Bachir, is a form of knowledge that, in order to understand a given object, distances it from oneself and dissects it. He writes that science, in particular, the idealized form of language in Cartesian thinking, is a language that reduces a being to its working parts and analyzes them as inanimate objects. Take, for example, the Cartesian analysis of movement. In Bergson Postcolonial, Bachir reminds us that technoscientific reasoning analyzes movement as a series of segments going from point A to point B. And he quotes Bergson saying that Cartesian reasoning, I quote, only understands immobility. When it wants to represent movement, it rebuilds it with juxtaposed stillness, end quote. This mathematical approach, tells Bachir, misses what is essential to movement, mobility, and vitality, the élan vital. Scientific reasoning analyzes exclusively inert matter and produces weak facsimiles of the world's vitality. We are at ease only in the discontinuous, the immobile, the dead, he writes again, quoting Bergson in Bergson Postcolonial. And the Euro-American most valued form of reasoning, Cartesian analytical scientific thinking, petrifies the world by calculating it, and Bachir reminds us the etymology of the word, calculus, from pebble. So it literally petrifies the world by turning it into inanimate matter. As Bachir highlights, the philosophers of negritude rejected the immobility of scientific discourse and set out to understand the world according to its vital forces, its rhythm, its movements. The philosophy of negritude has identified three diverging directions of life development. The original sin of scientific thinking was to see in vegetal life, instinctive life, and rational life three successive degrees in a single tendency that is developing. Whereas these are three diverging directions of an activity that split as it grew. Knowledge, argued the philosophers of negritude, should encompass all three dimensions. Yet the dominant Euro-American discourse has elevated science and rational life above all other modes of understanding the world. Challenging the Cartesian worship of reason, Senghor offers a different terminology that Bachir adopts in his writing in Bergson Postcolonial. He calls the Cartesian form of scientific reasoning reason I, la raison œil, and opposes it to reason embrace, la raison étreinte. So if René Descartes marks the triumph of reason I, negritude marks the ascent of reason embrace. And the poets of negritude, criticizing Cartesian's overemphasis on reason, set out to revalorize the instinctive way of life. But some negritude writing did not go as far as it could have in deconstructing Cartesian categories and only brings back incomplete unity to the Cartesian dissection of the world. 1 century later, Oceanitude would offer a new epistemology, continuing to realize the emancipatory potential of the negritude movement as theorized in Bashir's writing, as a new humanism. Oceanitude turns to the third term of the equation, the vegetal way of life, defined as the ability to borrow directly from the air, water, and soil the elements necessary to maintaining life. Because specific activists are fighting against environmental collapse by underscoring the codependency of human and the other than human. Indeed, human life is also a form of vegetal life, in as much as it depends on the places that sustain it to survive. This could be called, to play on Senghor's terminology, reason fusion. Because while the reason embrace promoted by the negritude thinkers did challenge the Cartesian dualism between mind and matter, it did not shatter it thoroughly. Senghor thought to rehabilitate reason embrace, to rebuild the unity between man and the world, linking the body and the soul, man with his kind, rocks and gods. The very word choices used by Senghor intimate the incompleteness of his revolutionary thinking. Everybody is criticizing Senghor, even though you yesterday explicitly said that we needed to rethink the consensus on these attacks. But you will see that this is not this is only a temporary criticism. The very word choices used in this specific quote intimates the incompleteness of his revolutionary thinking, because embracing means putting one's arms around something, getting closer to it, while still experiencing a sense of distinct individuality. So reason embrace still keeps the world at arm's length, whereas reason fusion, by contrast, acknowledges that the human cannot even exist without the other than human. It underscores that, as Marshallese poet Kathy Jetnil-Kidgener chants, we are nothing without our islands. Oceanitude thus constitutes the last of the three revolutions that redefined the human since the beginning of the scientific revolution. With Cartesianism, some humans became master and possessor of nature and simultaneously became alienated from the world. Negritude sought to bring the human back a little bit closer to the world, and today the thinkers of Oceanitude are staging another revolution. The human is no longer seen as the hinge of the world, but rather one of many components of the world, part and parcel with the world, and directly suffering from any harm done to the world. It's towards this codependency that I propose that we now turn. In Tavo's novel, Quand le cannibale ricane, the prologue explains « Ce récit est une tentative personnelle de réhabiliter une histoire, celle de l'insulaire. Cet insulaire océanien qui a tour à tour été traité des pires injures, cannibale, race dégénérée, foncièrement génétiquement sale. Non content hier de discréditer sa culture, aujourd'hui ils empoisonnent l'océan, Fukushima, dans lequel ils tirent sa nourriture. Le réchauffement climatique, la montée des eaux menacent avant tout les îles de submersion. So from the outset, Oceanitude is described as a relationship between the Oceanians and the ocean. His prologue highlights that the colonizers' desecration of Pacific people paves the way for the desecration of the ocean and vice versa. Because if Pacific people are described as intrinsically genetically filthy, then he says it becomes easy to conceive of the Pacific Ocean as an excellent open-air dumping ground for industrial countries' toxic waste and nuclear weapons. In this way, Oceania and Oceanians are fusional. This prologue sets the foundation for all Oceanitude writing that talks about indigenous modes of being in and relating to the world, exploring this link, this consubstantiality between Pacific people and the ocean as the foundation of Oceanitude. And this link is rooted in indigenous epistemologies, because Oceanitude's conceptions of collective identity are not based on race, as was the case in negritude. While the philosophers of negritude managed to reappropriate race, colonial construction, to use it and foster decolonial solidarities, the construct of race has not been reappropriated in a similar way in the Pacific for many reasons. But one of them being that the Pacific has been described by colonizers as having different races. But it's rather the concept of indigeneity that has been mobilized in Pacific decolonial movements. And unlike the concept of race, the notion of indigeneity comes from customary Pacific epistemologies centering the importance of genealogy. So the word genealogy in English and French doesn't really translate to the many words to say genealogy in the Pacific, like Mo'okuahau in Hawaii, Wakapapa in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or Papara'atupuna in Mo'ohinui. But as Bachir explains in De Langue à Langue, there is no real untranslatability, and differences can always be explained. So these Pacific words to say genealogy indicate familial relationships that extend well beyond the human to include islands, oceans, and stars as humanity's ancestors and relatives. One consequence of this genealogical way of understanding the world is that everything created on Earth is related as kin and therefore has the same value, from the smallest single-cell organisms to present-day humans. Contemporary scientific research is only recently catching up with the wisdom held in this ancestral knowledge about genealogical connections to all living beings. And this is what Oceanitude affirms as the philosophy of valuing the living together, la philosophie du vivre ensemble. Living together means not only nurturing good relations with other humans, between tribalisms, as I would say, across different countries and continents, but also nurturing loving relationships between humans and other than humans, be they animals, plants, or water, or stars. Which brings me back to Bachir and his understanding of negritude, because one of his main contributions of his writing on negritude is always fighting against the reduction of negritude to an anti-racist philosophy, always fighting against a reduction of negritude to a philosophy about race. Underscoring that Rimbaud and Bergson have been claimed by negritude thinkers, he positions negritude as always already beyond race, reminding with Senghor that la raison est la même dans tous les hommes, reason is the same in all men. He highlights that Cartesianism and negritude don't stem from un instinct de tribu, a tribal instinct. Cartesian thinking, while universal, has expressed itself, he writes, violently in European expansionism. Empathic thinking, while also universal, may be found in eloquent and vivid form in African art. To this, we may add that this heightened conscience of the interrelatedness of all living forms, while also universal, is expressed with particular strength and consistency in the philosophy of Oceanitude. But fundamentally, all three philosophies are universal. And this is crucial, and Bashir reminded it again yesterday. This is crucial to think about living together in the era of the Anthropocene and of global environmental collapse. In his article, Faire humanité ensemble et ensemble habiter la terre, he writes, on ne débouche pas naturellement sur l'humanité en partant des appartenances familiales et par élargissement progressif du terroir. Enfler la grenouille de l'instinct de tribu n'en fera pas le bœuf d'un instinct de l'humain. Il faut donc sortir de l'instinctuel pour se retrouver d'emblée dans la visée de l'humanité, en soi et dans les autres. Bachir invites us to consider negritude and, by extension, Cartesianism and Oceanitude as always already universal philosophies, which should be apprehended together to think the world holistically. There is no hierarchy between philosophies. There is no vertical universalism. All philosophies have equal value. And this is what makes them eco-critical philosophies. Because the world needs to be apprehended holistically to tackle the challenges of the Anthropocene. Other scholars, like Jennifer Wenzel, who was here yesterday, have already commented on the possibilities of reading negritude thinkers in eco-critical terms as philosophies of the Anthropocene. I just want to add here that there is a unique wisdom in approaching Cartesianism, negritude, and Oceanitude by emphasizing the genealogical connections between the three philosophies instead of emphasizing the ruptures between them. All three philosophies have universal value. What needs to be questioned is their verticality and hierarchization. Only by thinking laterally, as Bachir invites us in his work, we can place ourselves dans la visée de l'humanité, needed to tackle the most urgent global environmental issues over time. So, Bachir, thank you so much. Marururu.
Thank you, Anai. And we do understand that you will not be able to stay with us. But we really thank you for taking the time in difficult circumstances to come and present your very challenging paper. And following it, I will say, like the Senegalese will say, nous sommes avec vous, which is again the whole discussion we have been engaged in. The next presenter is Nadia Yala Kisukidi. She's an associate. I didn't say Kisukidi to avoid mixing things. She's an associate professor of French literature, thought and culture at New York University. And we are really happy that finally she decided to come uptown and visit us. So Yala is the author of Bergson ou l'Humanité créatrice, published in 2013. And she co-authored Dialogue Transatlantic with Brazilian feminist philosopher Jamila Ribeiro. She is, in addition to being a philosopher, she is also a novelist and published her book La Dissociation in 2022. And she has been also one of the coordinators of Singaravallu's Colonisation, not Histoire. And she forced me to write a piece on Histoire générale de l'Afrique with a very tiny space to do it. But why I'm interested in particular today in her presentation from the humanities to humanity, decolonize, translate, universalize, is that my very, actually, as you see, elegant student, you know, draw my attention to a foreword she wrote for a book by Maurits van Bever-Donker, Texturizing Difference, Black Consciousness Philosophy and the Script of Man, was published this year. And in her foreword, she questioned what she called a particular kind of humanism. She also questioned universal unity born in modern Europe that deny humanity to those beyond its own border, an exclusion achieved through the dispossession of other and the imposition of unsaleable asymmetry. And I think that this is an engagement with Bachir, and I hope that she will share her discussion in this forward with us. Yala, you have a floor. I hesitate to call her Yala because in my language, Yala is God.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I just have a little disappointment. I won't speak in English. I'm sorry. I will speak in French. And I will try to speak slowly. I would love to say that was really, it's an honor. I will just say the tribute in English and then switch. It's an honor for me to be here, an honor for me to have been invited to this moment. I must say that I know Bachir. He was in my PhD jury when I finished my thesis on Bergson a long time ago. And it was really important for me to meet him because I was in a kind of a schizophrenia in the French academia. And I didn't know how it was possible to think with thinkers coming from other continents than Western continents. And Bachir was perfect at that moment. I couldn't believe that such a person could exist, being able to talk about Bergson, to think with the greatest Western tradition, and to navigate into, African philosophy. And it was the beginning of a beautiful spiritual kinship that was possible, that was made possible through the university. I didn't know that university could embody that it was possible to follow this kind of path in the university. And I would love to pay an homage, we say that in English? Yeah? And to Bachir through a certain idea of the university that to me is embodied in his work in these tough moments. So I don't have PowerPoint. I will speak in French. And everything is written, so I will read. Don't sleep, please. Thank you. So, des humanités à l'humanité, traduire, décoloniser, universaliser. Alors, pour commencer, quand je me suis replongée dans la pensée de Bachir pour cette conférence, pour ce moment d'hommage, je me suis replongée dans le fagot de ma mémoire que j'ai relu. C'est un livre que j'aime beaucoup, un livre autobiographique, donc rédigé dans cette magnifique cité de New York pendant les mois de pandémie. Et Bachir donc rassemble le fagot de ses souvenirs, traçant donc le chemin qui a été celui de sa vie, allant de Saint-Louis jusqu'à cette ville des États-Unis. Mais dans ce livre, il y a un passage qui m'a particulièrement interpellée, c'est son arrivée à Columbia University. Et ce qu'il dit, en fait, de l'université, des universités américaines, et particulièrement de cette université. Si je n'ai pas fait d'erreur, parce que je suis une très piètre historienne, même si j'ai beaucoup travaillé avec des historiens, donc tu arrives à Columbia en 2008, et en 2008, tu évoques justement la manière dont tes réflexions t'ont amené à te confronter de façon plus directe à deux termes, postcolonial et décolonial. Le premier, postcolonial, étant porté par des figures éminentes de cette université, Gayatri Spivak et également Edward Said, qui n'était plus en poste, je crois, déjà à cette période. Et, pardon, bon. Tu évoques également dans cette manière dont tu te rapportes à ces termes, comment étrangement tu fais saisir à l'intérieur d'un espace de conflictualité qui ne se situait pas aux États-Unis, mais qui paradoxalement se situait en France. Et en Europe donc, puisque dans ce pays, 2008, des voix avaient commencé à mener une espèce de croisade intellectuelle contre les post-colonial studies, contre l'émergence du courant post-colonial qui est propre justement aux États-Unis. Et d'un côté, cette croisade intellectuelle, on pourrait la résumer de façon assez sommaire, avec de grosses éléments de dichotomie binaire. Donc d'un côté, il y aurait les relativistes, particularistes venus des mondes non européens, qui décrochent l'Occident, et de l'autre, les universalistes qui défendraient donc l'unité du monde. D'un côté, le capitalisme, où l'altérité constitue désormais un nouvel espace de rentabilité dans le marché des savoirs, et de l'autre, donc la constitution égalitaire d'un commun nourri par la mise à disposition d'un savoir accessible à tous. Et encore de l'autre, l'inconscience néolibérale de ces universités américaines et la conscience éclairée, républicaine, ou mieux marxiste en fait, qui se développerait sur les contrées françaises. Donc il est difficile d'envoler la pensée de Bachir Diagne, évidemment, dans ce type de bataille et de dichotomie très lourde. Mais, et c'est vrai qu'il me semble qu'on a voulu l'y installer. Et tu le dis toi-même dans le fagot de la mémoire, quand tu parles de l'engagement de ta réflexion avec Jean-Louis Hamsel, c'est vrai qu'immédiatement, il a fallu freiner Jean-Louis Hamsel et lui dire, dans ce dialogue, je ne serai pas, en tout cas, le relativiste en guerre contre l'universel. Et effectivement, en affinité avec la pensée de Balibar, ces dichotomies rigides, particulier versus universel, ou encore relativisme versus universalisme, ne construisent et ne structurent aucunement la pensée que tu déploies autour de l'universalisme. Ce qu'il faut saisir plutôt, c'est la conflictualité intrinsèque de l'universel dès lors qu'il est énoncé par un particulier, l'universel se disant toujours au pluriel, jamais au singulier. Ainsi, quand Souleymane Bachir Diagne fait le récit de ces années américaines, et particulièrement de cette année 2008, il me semble qu'on peut y lire deux réflexions implicites sur les conflictualités de l'universel. Une première concerne ce que les post-colonial studies, et peut-être le tournant décolonial, ont fait aux humanités, en recentrant l'idéalité de leur pratique autour de deux actes, traduire et décoloniser. Et la seconde interroge ce que ces actes font directement à l'institution qui les accueille et les permet, à savoir l'université comme institution et comme idée. Et donc j'aimerais déployer ces deux idées. J'ai déjà l'impression d'avoir parlé énormément, mais je vais pas aller vite. Pour revenir à ce qu'on peut appeler le tournant postcolonial dans la traduction, à partir de Souleymane Bachir Diagne, qui invite à poser les questions suivantes. Que fait-on du legs colonial une fois une nation indépendante et décolonisée? Que fait-on de ce legs qu'est la langue de l'Empire dans les nations jeunes qui doivent construire leurs institutions et donc les penser? J'aimerais commencer, non pas par Diagne, mais par un autre auteur pour qui la question de la traduction et de la décolonisation est centrale. C'est Cheikh Anta Diop. Cheikh Anta Diop, dans un livre important, écrit en 1954, publié en 1954, donc Nations nègres et culture, offre un modèle précis de l'articulation traduire et décoloniser. Lu depuis les USA, lire Cheikh Anta Diop depuis les USA, c'est passionnant, parce que justement, on est vraiment dans une réflexion sur la traduction qui est assez hallucinante, puisqu'on pourrait aussi avoir une approche assez métathéorique de l'acte de traduire. Je veux juste dire en 5 secondes comment est traduit, par exemple, le livre Nations nègres et culture aux États-Unis. Nations nègres et culture, c'est un livre qui est composé d'un ensemble de 2 parties, en fait. Une partie consacrée à l'Égypte nègre. Pardon pour le terme, en français, ça sonne. Je suis désolée, j'espère que j'ai offensé personne. Ça va bon. Donc l'Égypte nègre, la promotion finalement d'une Égypte et d'une grande civilisation noire sur le continent africain. Et après, et en général, c'est comme ça qu'on peut savoir si les étudiants ont lu le livre en entier, il y a plein de pages de traduction. Du Wolof dans d'autres langues, la Marseillaise est traduite, des passages d'Einstein, etc., etc. Donc le livre, c'est un grand traité de la traduction. Sauf que la traduction de Cheikh Anta Diop aux États-Unis de ce livre s'intitule The African Origin of Civilization, publié en 1989. Et le livre, en fait, est une anthologie de plusieurs ouvrages de Cheikh Anta Diop où ne sont retenues, en fait, que les thèses sur l'Égypte noire. C'est-à-dire que tous les passages sur la traduction sont complètement, et les réflexions sur les langues africaines, sont complètement oubliées des traductions américaines. Donc ici, c'est intéressant parce qu'on a effectivement une traduction noire de Cheikh Anta Diop qui, étrangement, le délie de son projet initial, qui est un projet de refondation de la civilisation africaine, intitulé « La Renaissance africaine ». Donc on a déjà une approche assez intéressante de Cheikh Anta Diop dans la traduction qui en a été faite. Mais ce que je voudrais dire sur Nation nègre et culture, c'est que, au-delà justement des thèses sur l'Égypte noire, c'est que la pensée de Cheikh Anta Diop est une réflexion sur la traduction. Et la traduction est pensée dans la Nation nègre et culture comme un acte politique de décolonisation. Traduire, c'est décoloniser, nous dit Cheikh Anta Diop. Et l'acte de traduction est au centre d'une refondation des humanités africaines après la brisure coloniale. Cheikh Anta Diop est conscient de la diglossie, je reprends le terme de Bachir Diagne, qu'il développe et qu'il déploie dans De langue à langue, est conscient de la diglossie coloniale, c'est-à-dire cette situation de bilinguisme, et je cite Souleymane Bachir Diagne, dans laquelle l'une des langues est considérée comme inférieure et dotée d'un capital culturel de moindre valeur. Cette diglossie est un frein à la décolonisation culturelle. Il faudra donc élever les langues, nous dit Cheikh Anta Diop, qui ont été politiquement minorées, non pas parce qu'elles sont intrinsèquement inférieures, mais parce qu'elles ont été volontairement réduites à l'intérieur de ce que Mudimbe pourrait appeler la structure coloniale. Alors, pour empêcher la réduction des langues africaines, un outil politique est primordial, et cet outil, c'est la traduction. La traduction est un outil donc, pour lutter contre la diglossie, et ce, dans une direction précise. 1. Elle doit s'inscrire dans un projet de promotion des langues nationales africaines contre les langues impériales européennes. Et 2, dans cette optique, la traduction devient un outil politique de libération à la fois nationale et panafricaine, dont les effets sont immédiatement matériels. Je cite pour le plaisir un passage de Cheikh Anta Diop, de Nation nègre et culture, l'impérialisme culturel est la vis de sécurité de l'impérialisme économique. Détruire les bases du premier, c'est contribuer à la suppression du second. Alors ce projet de traduction-décolonisation va prendre plusieurs sens. Je vais aller assez vite sur ce point. Il y a au moins 3 sens de ce qu'est la traduction d'un sens politique dans ce texte de Cheikh Anta Diop. Il s'agit d'introduire dans les langues africaines des concepts capables de rendre les idées scientifiques du monde moderne, premier élément. Il s'agit ensuite de penser la traduction au sens d'un passage d'une langue source à une autre, sans en altérer le sens. Et enfin, il s'agit de traduire au sens de transposer, de produire une littérature en langue nationale. Cette conception de la traduction s'inscrit dans un projet de défense des langues africaines en contexte de décolonisation. Traduire, nous dit Cheikh Anta Diop, c'est participer à l'entreprise politique donc, de décolonisation. J'aimerais revenir à Souleymane Bachir Diagne. Dans le fagot de ma mémoire, Souleymane Bachir Diagne revient sur sa rencontre avec un autre éminent intellectuel, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, dans les années 80 à Bayreuth. Pour Ngugi wa Thiong'o, la décolonisation de l'esprit exige, je cite Souleymane Bachir Diagne, de tourner le dos à la langue du colonisateur pour faire retour aux langues africaines. Chez Ngugi wa Thiong'o, cette thèse s'accompagne d'un rapport critique à la pensée de Léopold Sédar Senghor, chantre de la langue française, et opposé justement à la figure de Cheikh Anta Diop qu'il fait sienne. Ce passage du fagot de ma mémoire est important, car il permet justement de situer, il me semble, la pensée de la traduction de Souleymane Bachir Diagne dans ce débat structuré autour du couple traduire-décoloniser. Souleymane Bachir Diagne n'est pas anti-diopien, mais il n'est pas diopien. Il propose un autre modèle du traduire-décoloniser qui n'a pas la même visée éthique et politique. S'il s'agit bien de promouvoir une égalité entre les langues, pas de langues inférieures, pas de langues supérieures, la liberté qu'offre la traduction, et même sa politique, ne consiste pas à déployer un projet national, mais à développer les bases d'une cosmo-citoyenneté concrète, engageant à la fois une réflexion sur notre rapport au monde, qu'est-ce que c'est que d'être de ce monde, et interrogeant la manière dont se constitue notre rapport à ce monde sur le mode de la citoyenneté. Un philosophe, Étienne Tassin, dessinait 3 figures de la cosmo-citoyenneté, c'est-à-dire d'être citoyen du monde. Celle du rebelle, celle de l'officier, celle de l'essayeur. Diogène de Sinope, le cynique, en figure du rebelle. Être citoyen du monde, c'est refuser toute allégeance étatique et toute appartenance à la cité. L'officier, on le retrouverait plutôt dans l'idée de la cosmo-citoyenneté stoïcienne. Il s'agirait finalement de réaffirmer son appartenance au monde et à sa communauté. Et l'essayeur, qui naviguerait dans le sillage de la pensée de Diderot et de Montaigne, serait précisément celui qui vivrait sa cosmo-citoyenneté en apprenant à se désidentifier, à se désaffilier de ses appartenances, tout en réaffirmant son engagement dans la communauté. Or, il me semble qu'avec la pensée de Bachir Diagne, on pourrait proposer peut-être une 4e figure de la cosmo-citoyenneté. Ni sceptique, ni cynique, ni stoïcienne, mais j'aimerais proposer ce mot acolonial, c'est-à-dire ni postcolonial, ni décolonial non plus, mais acolonial, c'est-à-dire défaite justement des hiérarchies et des représentations construites durant la colonisation. Et cette 4e figure de la cosmo-citoyenneté serait donc celle du traducteur. L'acte de traduction consistant en un jeu constant de désaffiliation et de désidentification de langue à langue pour produire en acte le commun de l'humanité. L'humanité n'existant que comme réalité multilingue. Le traducteur, ainsi, en se donnant un droit d'accès à toutes les langues, le citoyen de toutes les langues donc, crée les conditions d'un monde hospitalier où il lui est possible partout d'habiter, c'est-à-dire d'entrer en dialogue, en interlocution avec d'autres. Voilà ainsi donc la possibilité de penser ou d'éprouver ce couple traduire, décoloniser chez Souleymane Bachir Diagne à l'intérieur d'une réflexion, il me semble, sur la cosmo-citoyenneté. Alors pour finir, être citoyen du monde, c'est vrai que c'est une idée très dure, qui peut sembler extrêmement obscène, surtout quand on la rattache à la possibilité, à la réalité des contraintes qui poussent certaines personnes à ne jamais sortir de leur pays, parce qu'on les force à rester, parce que leurs pays sont des prisons, en fait. Et dans la notion de cosmo-citoyenneté, ce qu'est ce monde, le monde dans lequel nous naviguons, etc., peut véritablement apparaître à la fois comme un non-lieu théorique ou comme un non-lieu empirique. Mais il me semble qu'il faut vraiment lire la cosmo-citoyenneté de manière très concrète chez Souleymane Bachir Diagne, parce qu'il y a bien un lieu où elle se réalise concrètement et de manière effective, c'est l'université. Et c'est sur ces derniers mots, la notion d'université, que j'aimerais terminer cette réflexion. Il me semble qu'une des dimensions du modèle traduire décoloniser, tel qu'il se déploie dans la pensée de Diagne, consiste à donner une figure concrète à ce monde à travers cette institution paradoxale qu'est l'université. L'université, telle qu'on pourrait l'imaginer avec la pensée de Diagne, est une des formes que prend le monde dans sa concrétude, soit un des espaces physiques possibles où il se donne en sa totalité. Le monde étant compris de manière assez sommaire dans mon texte, comme un concept à minima, celui de la communauté humaine. Voilà ce qu'est le monde. Donc il faudrait réimaginer le rêve de Cheikh Anta Diop, qui, en se déterritorialisant, à la fois se dénationalise et se décontinentalise. L'université, donc, n'est pas une enceinte nationale, n'est pas une nation, c'est l'espace physique concret, l'institution à l'intérieur de laquelle se font en acte la traduction et la décolonisation. Et si le monde s'y donne, c'est précisément parce que l'articulation de ces deux pratiques, traduire, décoloniser, produit l'acte d'universaliser. L'université américaine, telle que l'a rencontrée Bachir Diagne dans Le fagot de ma mémoire, et telle qu'il la raconte, dans son idéalité, il est possible qu'une entreprise soit idéale, et cette université où les humanités se sont refondées autour de ces deux pratiques, décoloniser et traduire. Décoloniser et traduire, c'est-à-dire universaliser, c'est-à-dire un espace où le monde s'expose sans distinction. Car le verbe universaliser dit mieux que le substantif universalisme ou l'adjectif universel, ce qu'il en est dès lors qu'on s'engage sur les voies concrètes de l'universel. Il ne s'agit pas de produire une série d'énoncés qui ne sont porteurs d'aucun effet matériel. Il s'agit plutôt de concevoir l'universel comme un souhait, une visée, qui requiert une pratique, faire éclater les frontières de la tribu, on l'a dit, entrechoquer le pluriel du monde, pour réaliser en acte l'humanité en son unité. Le lieu dédié à cette pratique, donc, c'est l'université dans des pays démocratiques, où dans la refondation constante des humanités se joue la possibilité de réaliser le commun de notre humanité dans le passage d'une langue à une autre. L'université devenant ce lieu de réalisation concrète d'une forme de la cosmo-citoyenneté. Derrida disait qu'au sein de l'université est toujours engagée une certaine idée de l'homme, de l'humanisme. Elle est discutée, questionnée en tout cas, à travers la refondation constante des humanités, appelée par l'acte de traduire et de décoloniser. On peut ainsi, et je terminerai avec ces mots, imaginer un des cheminements de l'œuvre de Bachir Diagne dans le compagnonnage de Derrida, affinant la profession de foi qui ouvre les premières pages de l'université sans condition. Je cite Jacques Derrida. « On peut exhiber l'impuissance de l'université, la fragilité de ses défenses devant tous les pouvoirs qui la commandent, la siège et tente de se l'approprier. Parce qu'elle est étrangère au pouvoir, parce qu'elle est hétérogène aux principes de pouvoir, l'université est aussi sans pouvoir propre. » Pour revenir à Diagne, c'est précisément parce qu'elle est étrangère au pouvoir que l'université est ce lieu au sein duquel quelque chose de notre être au monde peut être pensé et éprouvé librement. Ce qu'il nous lègue ainsi, en cette année non pas 2008 mais 2025, en se retirant maintenant donc, c'est le témoignage de cette infinie fragilité. Si l'université peut être accueil du monde, c'est-à-dire le lieu continu d'une dépossession de soi, il ne faut pas être naïf et ne surtout pas croire en sa puissance présumée. Une université n'est pas un empire et n'est jamais un empire. En se faisant espace où habitent les traducteurs, Diagne nous invite ainsi à ressaisir le sens de cet espace dans son essentielle fragilité. Merci.
Thank you, Nadia Yala. And thank you for a presentation which is bringing us back to the discussion about dispossession, repossession in the act of translating. And we are going to continue that discussion with the next presenter, Nasrin Qader, who is an associate professor of French and comparative literary study at the Department of French and Italian at Northwestern University. And she does comparative literature. She is interested in Francophone African literature, Arabic literature of the Maghreb, Islamic thought, mysticism, and contemporary literary visual theory. And she has been for many years a colleague of Bachir and a friend also of Bachir. She's the author of Narrative of Catastrophe, Boris Job, Benjelloun, and Khatibis, 2009. And she's completing her second book, Chance at Play in Francophone African Literature. The title of her presentation is Souleymane Bachir Diagne, Laye, a conversation on aesthetic. And I am really eager to listen to her because I think she's embarked in an enterprise to salvage Laye.
Thank you, Mamadou. I have a lot of papers, so let me organize myself here. Good morning, everyone. Please allow me to begin with a translation. I'll do the original first. نه افغانیم و نه ترک و تتاریم، چمنزادیم و از یک شاخساریم. تمیز رنگ و بو بر ما حرام است که ما پرورده یک نوبهاریم. Translation. We are not Afghans, Turks, or Tatars. Offsprings of the garden, we grew from the same bough. Distinction of color and scent is forbidden to us. We are nurtured by the same new spring. Muhammad Iqbal, Message from the East, Quatrain 83. I am not a philosopher, and I'm quite aware of being in the august company of philosophers, mostly. But I shamelessly draw on Bashir's work to think about literature. And I'm not the only one. Because I am justified in this, we are justified in this, because Bashir himself is something of a literary type. I have 3 reasons to prove my claim here. First, he seems to favor poet-philosophers. In much of his work, Iqbal, Senghor, as well as other writers such as Cheikh Anta Diop and others. Sheikh Amidou Khan, and also Cheikh Anta Diop. 2, Bashir's writing and oratory have a certain literary panache to them. A Bashirian oral discourse is, for instance, is composed of the following. 1, at least one well-placed joke. 2, at least one anecdote, not too long, not too short, with just the right dose of spice. Literary, right? 3, my third claim is Bashir is secretly, although I don't know how much of a secret it is, but I think it's a secret. Bashir is secretly himself something of a poet. Not just any poet, mind you. He can wax some mean Alexander verse in French, and at times these verses may somehow compete with the great Racine. If you want to know how I know this, you can ask me later. Okay? For all these reasons, I will shamelessly put Bashir's thought in conversation, or should we say in germination, following Professor Diagne's talk yesterday, with one of my own favorite writers, but it appears also Mamadou's favorite writers, Camara Laye. So let's begin. In 2023, the Art Institute of Chicago presented an exhibit entitled The Language of Beauty in African Art, foregrounding the breadth of art historical reflection on aesthetics from various regions of the African continent. The exhibit catalog features essays by leading art historians and cultural anthropologists focused on Africa's famed statuary. In the acknowledgement to the catalog, the Constantine Petrides, chair and curator of Arts of Africa at the Art Institute, thanks the anthropologist Wilfried van Dam for having proposed the idea of the exhibit to him with the aim of, and I quote, countering the prevalent erroneous view that African people have no aesthetics, end of quote. The endurance of this remarkable prejudice may come as something of a shock, if we are still able to be shocked, to Africanists, having cut their scholarly teeth for decades on the work of leading scholars of African aesthetics, such as Souleymane Bachir Diagne, whose seminal work is now a reference in the field. On this occasion of celebrating Bashir's enormous field-shaping oeuvre, I follow in his footsteps, as is often the case with me, in making a round in the field of aesthetic thought by turning my attention to the literary. Specifically, I want to offer a preliminary reading of Camara Laye's Le Maître de la Parole, published in 1978, a rendition of the Sundiata epic by drawing from Bashir's thoughts on African art. But first, I want to linger a little longer in the vicinity of the debates on African aesthetics not only to recall the long history of this thinking, but also to contextualize Laye. The framing of the exhibit brought back to my mind another moment in the history of aesthetic thought, harkening back to the first World Festival of Negro Arts in Dakar in 1966, where a colloquium was organized on, and this is the title, The Function and Significance of African Negro Art in the Life of the People and for the People. That's the title. The contributions have been gathered in a volume which, in the opening words of Engelbert Meweng, the volume is only available to me in English, so I have all the citations in English. So in the words of Engelbert Meweng, tells the story of the creative genius of Africa, end of quote. Among the essays is Aris Memel-Fote's, noted anthropologist, entitled The Perception of Beauty in Negro African Culture, end of quote, recalled by the scholars in the catalog of the Chicago exhibit. Memel-Fote debunks three prejudices in the discourse of aesthetics about Africa and declares them already things of the past. First, and I quote, there was a time when to search for the perception of beauty in Negro African culture, worse than illegitimate and senseless, would have been forbidden, end of quote. Secondly, recalling the ethnographer Marcel Griol's statement that in Black Africa, as everywhere, there exists a free art as well as a religious art, end of quote, he writes, so Memel-Fote challenges the notion that all African art is purely religious or sacred. So he writes, and I quote, alongside statuary, sacred art, there are secular arts, a literature of tales, decorations, a variety of music, end of quote. Thirdly, he recalls that in Western aesthetic history, even the service arts, by which I think he means both applied arts and sacred arts, and I quote him, we see that an aesthetic has been made of certain of these Western arts, which have many traits in common with Negro arts. The aesthetics, for example, of Greek art, which reveals an analogous tie between beauty and the good. He then asks, how, with the same postulate, can a successful aesthetic be possible in one case and not in the other, end of quote. He concludes his essay poignantly by writing, I quote him again, let us conclude by stressing this point, that objective and universal recognition of beauty is an act of justice and of equity, end of quote. Memel-Fote, therefore, calls not only for a diversity of aesthetics as universal patrimony, but also for a truly universal justice attendant to aesthetic recognition. The philosophical force of this universal ethics finds its apogee in Souleymane Bachir Diagne's notions of African art as translational and mutant, in the sense of always already mobile, universal, and changing, as he explains in his 2022 work, De Langue à Langue. This notion of mutant not only insists on the place of African arts always already within human aesthetic patrimony, but also proposes a singular idiom to this art elaborated in African art as philosophy, attendant to rhythm, affect, and hearing, rather than form, contemplation, and vision. I understand the movement of Bachir's thought on art throughout his work on aesthetics to account for both the singularity of African artistic idioms and the universality of its open address that ultimately resists appropriation as well as rigorous localization or particularization. At the same time, the figure of translation suggests a certain opaqueness, to borrow from Glissant and from himself, he talked about it in his speech the other night, that resists transparency. The rhythm of African art thus lies in this movement and tension constitutive of reserve and hospitality, the subtitle of De Langue à Langue. In my reading of Camara Laye's final novel, I draw inspiration from Bachir's reflections on rhythm, because they allow me to tackle in a preliminary fashion today an aesthetic question that has captured my interest lately, the problem of the ugly. To be sure, the ugly is not part of Bachir's idiom, far from it. So I am stretching and perhaps even deforming his thoughts a little. I understand the question of the ugly in aesthetic thought to be intricately linked to that of form. My starting point of reference in this debate is, of course, Kant, who, in the Critique of Judgment, has famously conceived of the ugly and the terrible as challenges to the beautiful and the formal function of the imagination. The ugly, a particular focus of recent scholarship on Kant, shakes the form, beauty, such that it does not perfectly or easily relate to finality as it does with the beautiful. The ugly is not the sublime, awe and respect before the incalculable grandeur, but rather a shaking and perhaps a threat at the limit of form. Shall we say rhythm? At work in the very schema and the frame. Kant saves the beautiful from the ugly's disturbance, the form from the threat of deformation, by proposing that the ugly may be overcome by the formal function of the imagination and rendered beautiful. Therefore, while the ugly is a challenge and a threat to the subject's aesthetic experience, the pleasure at the play of its faculties, the formal power of the imagination can transform and overcome it. Only one ugliness cannot be represented without destroying the subject's aesthetic experience and the work as beautiful, that which excites disgust. That's paragraph 48. In the catalog at the exhibit at Chicago, a great deal of reflection is oriented toward the question of the ugly in African art as a complex relation of form to that which exceeds it. The ugly is primarily presented here as an expression of power and force. In post-colonial aesthetic thought on Africa, the dialectic of beautiful, ugly has preoccupied scholars explicitly for at least 2 decades now, exemplified by the 2006 volume Beautiful Ugly under Sarah Nuttall's direction that brought together such eminent figures as Achille Mbembe, Simon Gikandi, Françoise Vergès, Mia Koto, and others. In this volume, the ugly, a feature of colonial discourse on Africa, is repeatedly brought back to the affirmation of the beautiful. However, I read Bachir's philosophy of rhythm as addressing the ugly indirectly, which has the advantage of avoiding the ideological underpinnings of the ugly-beautiful opposition. Rhythm, in my reading, constitutes the mobility in the relation between the formalism of the beautiful and the excess and power of the formless. And it is the movement of the beautiful's restlessness at the limit of form. In the essay L'Afrique et les griots, included as a preamble to Le Maître de la Parole, Camara Laye insists on the aesthetic and artistic dimensions of African art, such as legends, songs, sculpture, and tales. Jonathan Ribenas has noted this passage and writes that, and I quote, "For Camara Laye, the act of communication is above all an aesthetic one, rather than a reaffirmation of community and identity." In Laye's Le Maître, my focus on the ugly finds its élan in the figure of Sogolon, Sundiata's famous and powerful mother, who is perhaps one of the most beloved figures of African literature. From version to version of the epic, she is qualified as both powerful and ugly by 3 features: protruding eyes, a hump on her back, and a powerful physique. But she is also the only one who can save the empire of the aging king, Megan Konfata, by giving birth to his heir. Sogolan's ugliness is directly related to her fearsome powers, since she is endowed with two totems, the buffalo and the panther. But these powers also enable her to resist productivity, I mean reproduction, annulling her destiny as the mother of the emperor. Contradiction marks the story at its start, and a tug and pull, a rhythm of form and resistance to it. When her husband, King Magan Konfata, is unable to approach her because she transforms herself into a porcupine and thus is unattainable, the narrator wonders if the king might have wanted to say to her that the Conde tribe should have contented themselves with just one totem like all the others. And the French is que la tribu Condé devrait se contenter d'un totem ancêtre comme toutes les autres. He only has one totem, the lion, and is no match for her. So the problem is how to even start this story. Clearly, somehow, Sogolan's powers must be cut down to size and framed. The difficulties attending to Sogolan's powerful ugliness at the beginning of this work are first and foremost formal. In contrast to Sogolan, her male counterparts are all qualified as beautiful. Laye overtly frames Sogolan's arrival at the court of Magan Konfata at the beginning of the story, and I quote, placed between the hunters as though framed by them. And the hunters are beautiful, both of them. Condé, selon Condé, placé au milieu des chasseurs et comme encadré par eux. These young, beautiful hunters have received Sogolan as their reward for having killed her aunt, a powerful force who was wreaking havoc in the neighboring kingdom of Do. This attention to framing alerts us to Sogolan's threat to the possibility of the formation of an empire, with which the epic is concerned. Her double physical excesses, as protrusions, her eyes and her hump, signal that this power is hardly held at bay by the beautiful, the hunter, on each side. Yet Laye turns the dynamic of terror around in this story. For to cut Sogolan's powers to size, the beautiful must become violence and terror. He displaces the potential terror of the ugly to the beautiful's drive to form and measure, and thus opens an ethical question in the heart of aesthetic formalism. Here is what happens. A hunter has told the Mande king that a powerful but ugly young woman will give birth to a son. But Sogolan resists this destiny. So on the wedding night, the king decides, and I quote him, Laye, that to pull Sogolan out of her neutral attitude, he had to terrorize her. Pour tirer Sogolan de son attitude neutre, il fallait la terroriser. He then therefore jumps up and tells her that he will cut her throat comme un poulet. His sudden burst and threat terrify her such that she surrenders, and so the child is conceived. The narrator, adopting Sogolan's perspective through Laye's famous free indirect style, qualifies the beautiful as un oiseau rapace, the king, as an oiseau rapace, rapacious bird, crushing the young woman who thinks to herself, what kind of a man is this Magan Konfata to throw himself on me as a wild beast? Quelle sorte d'homme est ce Magan Konfata pour se jeter sur moi comme un fauve? Sogolan's transformative powers and potentiality are thus tamed and rendered formative and productive for the artistry of the king's by the artistry of the king's technique, his play acting and his ruse. Not only for the sake of the empire, but first and foremost for the sake of the story. This dialectic of the beautiful and ugly, of formalism and threat of formlessness provides the rhythm for the entire narrative, where Sundiata must constantly confront enemy kings, always more powerful than him, epitomized by the Otham Sumauro, endowed with 60 totems and born by 3 mothers before his birth. Though Sogolan never resorts to her own powers after her son's birth, Sundiata's opponents incarnate that power, and they are defeated by the young emperor-to-be by way of play acting and ruses, mediated often by his allies. Camaralai's rendition of the famous epic as the foundation of a great empire is therefore also an invitation and a provocation to reflect not only on aesthetic categories of the beautiful and the ugly and their rhythm, but also on their attendant ethical and political charges. I stop here with thanks to the organizers for this wonderful event and for the invitation, and to Bachir for his amazing work, and especially his French.
Thank you, Nasrin. Our next presenter is my friend and colleague Ali Benmakhlouf. Ali is a professor at Mohammed VI Polytechnic University in Morocco after a very long, if you want, career in France. And he is the director of the Center for African Studies. His research interests include Arabic philosophy, the philosophy of logic, and question of bioethics. His publications include Pourquoi lire les philosophes arabes, l'héritage oublié, 2015, La force des raisons, logique et médecine, 2018, La réalité du passé, 2022, L'humanité des autres, 2023. And like Bachir, he engages with the concept of humanism, the concept of universalism, as well as the context of, and this is the subtitle, of the l'humanité des autres. But what is interesting in his presentation of today, because he's engaging with Bachir, is he is epitomizing, if you want, the kind of continuity between North Africa and West Africa. He is operating within a historical space we call today Northwest Africa, which incorporate part of North Africa. He is also coming back to the concept of family. I will also talk about family. So the title of his presentation is Family, Commercial, and Spiritual Relation, Saint-Louis and Fez. And this is a terroir which actually Ali is framing as a terroir of knowledge production. Ali, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mamadou. Yes, it's quite risky what I'm doing now because I'm just shifting to history and I'm not completely a historian, as you know. So first of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this great event, this great conference, especially Emmanuel Sada, Fanny Gex, Shani Pierce, and all the students, Yu Long, and the others. I apologize, I don't know all the names. They show us exactly what Jean-Godefroy Bidima said yesterday, a proactive hospitality that sacrifices something by hosting us in this such manner. Even if they do everything willingly, they still sacrifice their time, which is one of the precious things. Thank you. for not bringing tears so quickly. I will not evoke all the memories I share with Bachir for now more than 4 decades. That's why I go directly to the topic I announce. First, I will try to have with you a thought experiment, then shift to the teaching of terre to evoke this relation between Fez and Saint-Louis, and then in the end, something about home as transnational country. I'm very happy to see Madina Diagne here and Mamadou Diouf, because all what I will be saying is due to their influence. They said, Ali, please do microhistory. So thank you. I try to not to, to disappoint you. First, I'd like to suggest a thought experiment. Imagine that the silent strip linking Morocco to Senegal is a sea and not a land. A sea that is crossed without the current borders. It's this space that has been, since the 13th and 14th centuries of the Common Era, a real space and not a thought experience, with a specific anthropologic dynamic. The stories of Ibn Battuta, the traveler and chronicler of the early 14th, like those of Ibn Khaldun, a generation after him, and even Leo Africanus in the 16th century, introduce us to a connected world where exchanges take place not only between what we call now North Africa and its west, but also between this part of Africa and East Africa, as all the way to Yemen and Mecca. Let's stop confining Africa to the compartments that geopolitics want to impose. Since the war of 2003, a new category emerges, MENA, Middle East, North Africa, separating North Africa from its south, which is so weird when we have a sense of history. I have to confess that I hate this word, MENA. I hate it. It's not an academic word. Before the devastation of the Atlantic slave trade, Africa was regularly crossed from west to east for obvious religious reasons, notably around the Muslim religion. Pilgrims were on their way to make the pilgrimage. But this journey could last not only months, but even years. It was better to have the know-how to go anywhere and look after your needs. That's why before the colonization and the introduction of French school in Fez, for example, between the age of 12 and 18, you'd learn a trade, then go back to school, that is to say, namely university, or continue your trade. But between 12 and 18, you are just learning some work, practical one. As was the case of my father, for instance, who started to work at 12, not because his family was poor, but because it was the standard of learning. If you show any ability for studying, you join the university at 18. If not, you continue your trade, as does my father. Between North and West, the route was also a spiritual one, a pilgrimage oriented towards visits to the saints. Saints' tombs are not simply places of meditation. They are libraries, they are schools, they are places for religious and commercial discussions. Mortal Souci, maybe this name evokes nothing for you. Mortal Souci, has a Moroccan scholar, has traveled extensively in southern Morocco, documenting the connectivity of the Sahara and the Sahelian zone. He wrote more than 40 books. from the 30s to the 70s of last century, but no one is translated in European languages. Spiritual relationships are never quite separate from commercial ones. It's commerce, in the old French sense of the word, having general human links with people and at the same time, links of buying and selling. So I jump to the second part of my talk, Fez and Saint-Louis, the teaching of Teranga. Today I'd like to talk to you about this type of relationship which starts by founding a family far away. Many merchants from the city of Fez in Morocco ended up in Saint-Louis and stayed there for a long time, marrying on the spot, founding a family, as was the case of my own maternal family. My grandfather, as well as my great-grandfather, married Saint-Louis women. As Mamadou Diouf puts it, we still need to clear the way for microhistory, a path blocked by macrohistory, that of dynasties, and then to look at what happens on the daily basis and how this daily life, when described in its familial, spiritual, and commercial dimension, makes history. The Saint Sidi Ahmed Tijani is a pole of attraction in Fez for a large Senegalese community. This can still be seen today when you approach the street where in the Medina in Fez, his mausoleum stands there, not far from the prestigious Qarawiyyin mosque founded in the 8th century. Some time ago, I gave Bachir Diagne's reception speech at the Academy of the Kingdom of Morocco. I emphasized his philosophical work, from his work on Boule and Iqbal to that on language and as hospitality, as well as his ever renewed interest in a notion he helped to universalize Ubuntu. I will not repeat myself today. What use would it be for him to listen that again? So today I'd like to take up the notion of hospitality in the wake not of Ubuntu, but of a value widely shared in Senegal, that of teranga. Teranga tells us that welcome is not separate from solidarity and hospitality. It transcends the religions, ethnic groups, and languages spoken in Senegal. Teranga introduces transcendence into the very heart of reality without looking for it in religions. Making hospitality, solidarity, that is to say, teranga, an objective value shared by the Senegambia people is a vision that introduced transcendence in reality. I use the word of vision, ethical vision, because teranga implies eye, orientation, gaze, orientation. What are you looking at? We could say that teranga translates religious motives into the public space in such a way that all religions recognize themselves in it without being able to say that they are the ones who initiated it. With teranga, the good, leaves the realm of subjective desire, of free will, for that of the objectivity of shared values. It's clear to everyone that we need to elevate the economic and psychological misery of someone around us. It's not a question of choice. It's not a question of desire, if it is, some will say, the supreme desire. You have to do it. It's a question of necessity. Ask always, say, Simone Weil, the philosophers, not the political woman, French woman, ask always what is the impulsion that puts you to do this and not for what purpose you are doing this. Teranga value is not related to any desire, to any choice, but rather to renewed attention. In other words, Teranga is an ethical vision, an orientation of the mind, as Plato would say, rather than a proven skill, with the entire soul, said Plato in the famous passage of the Cave Republic. As Desmond Tutu put it, Ubuntu means feeling belittled when others are belittled. It was quoted yesterday by Ramatoulaye. In a complementary way, Teranga, I'll try to say it in Wolof, Tereul Magalinit. In a, don't bring me tears, please, in a complementary way, Teranga means taking care to uplift others. In every sense of the word uplift, bringing them upwards and also helping them to grow. Let's quote an Italian anthropologist, Fedora Gasparetti, in a paper called Relying on Teranga Senegalese Migrants to Italy and Their Children Left Behind. I quote, Amadou, the young owner of a phone center in Turin, points out that this is just part of the process, a cultural system of mutual assistance. We asked if he was either frustrated about having to house and find employment for his brothers when they moved to Italy to join him. It's normal, he responded. They helped you to get here. Now you help them from here. When you take the elevator to the top, you have to send it back down to pick up the others. 2008. There's a family resemblance, of course, between Ubuntu and Teranga. Teranga has a cosmic aspect, fighting against the fragmentation of the universe, a social aspect, fighting against the fragmentation of society, an anthropological aspect, fighting against the fragmentation of the human being. It's a form of harmony in all spheres of existence. Now, my last moment, I called it home as transnational country. There is a universality to Teranga, and it's expressed this way. Whatever the person's origins, age, or religion, do everything possible to make the person to whom we express Teranga feel at home, as if they were at home so that they can dance their being. In concrete terms, what happens when you are driven out of your home, when you are no longer at home, when an entire village is displaced for mining purposes? That's the fate of the village in eastern Senegal known as Sabo Dala. It was discovered that it was located on a gold mine. The government offered to house the inhabitants elsewhere. This is not Teranga. This is greed. The inhabitants refused, despite promised compensation. They had a strong argument. They couldn't abandon their dead buried there. They are in continuity with the dead people. The dead underground continue to live, but in a world unknown to those on earth. They also protect the families of the living. The living close the eyes of the dead, we said ordinarily, but the dead open the eyes of the living, enduring them with a enduring them with that helps completely to live. In other words, that direct their view towards the non-fragmentation of the world. Professor Ibrahim Tiao's archaeological team has tried to express some teranga in this case of Sabodala. Specific places have been set aside so that the inhabitants of the village of Sabodala can pay their respects to the graves of their ancestors. I'd not like to come back, I'd now like to come back to what I said about the need for microhistory. Teranga is embedded by the Senegalese people who have come to live in Morocco, and I would say more particularly the Senegalese women. Teranga places the women at the center as she is the one who takes care of the welcome. What I am told about my grandmother, she died in 1948, I don't know her, she died before the marriage of the wedding of my mother. What I have been told about my grandmother who came to Fez from Saint Louis in 1932 is very much part of Teranga. Of course, Moroccan hospitality is certainly legendary, but many Moroccans were surprised to see that these women woman's hospitality, her magnanimity, her welcome was something they didn't know. They gave everything she had. If someone complimented her kaftan, she'd get up, change, and hand it over. This gesture, one of the few passed on to me from her, is very much part of Teranga. So sorry. What's more, she was involved in the practice of holding a big house you are belonging to. As Françoise Héritier said in her books, in Western Africa, to be a member of a family is to belong to the same house. We will call it home. This house could be a transnational house, part of it in a country, part in another. For example, in the case of my grandmother, 2 of her children were grown up in Fez when she was living in Saint Louis. The consequence is that many cousins called each other sisters and brothers, with so many nuances as to call your cousin little brother, even if he is older than you. And don't ask me now about all these relationships, but for example, my mother had sisters who were their cousins. So that's one of the brotherhoods we were talking about yesterday. Now, it's what's still happening in many families who migrate to Europe. They often leave or send their children to be grown up in Senegal. And my mother herself, even if in the 50s the generalization of nuclear family was almost everywhere, she sent my sister to be raised in Fez, and she, I mean my mother, still lives in Dakar for about 10 years, from 1950 to 1960. It's a custom of fostering, well documented by the British anthropologist Jacques Goudy. Home is a family without borders. Home is transnational entity. Home introduces you to broaden your sense of brotherhood, sisterhood, and think naturally, if I may say, that your mother could be another woman, even if your mother is still alive. Belonging to a home is much more important to belong to a nuclear family. Conclusion. I try to be in this lecture a speaker, a locuteur, not only a reader and lector. It's hard. If there is any belonging to a country, it is because of the belonging to home. And this belonging itself has much to do with longing than belonging, as home is at the same time a reality and horizon. So many shared proverbs, sayings between Morocco and Senegal are example of close ties among the broad family. Sisters and brothers are like fingers on a hand. We say it in Morocco, we say it in Senegal. You cannot separate them, not put inequality among them. We have to pay more attention to these sayings and not reducing them to orality wisdom. They are strong and brief reasoning, very similar to the topoi in Aristotle's Topic. This reminds me that what Paul Ricoeur wrote, the more you deepen your culture, the more you encounter the cultures of others. Yesterday, as well as the day before, Bachir mentions the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This declaration was written after the awful fragmentation of the world by the Nazis. That's why it says, this declaration, that humanity is a family. I quote the very beginning of the Declaration, Universal Declaration of 1948. Whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, peace in the world. That is to say that we have not to reduce the concept of family to a nuclear one. That's why I call Bachir brother, and this is not just a use in African and among African Americans. I was thinking about Maya Angelou used to say that her grandmother called her sister. Hi, sister. It has also a philosophical ground in Plato in his Republic. The passage I would like to quote is also in a law context. Plato says in Book 3, 4.1.4b, that the inhabitants of a city have to consider each one for the other as a brother having the same mother, which is the earth, not the city. And this is what the ruler, the legislator, has to remind his people every time. The Teranga expresses this as a human duty, not a duty that you chose, but a duty that you practice with necessity. Bachir said yesterday that we see easily what could be a claim or a demand for liberty and for equality. But what could be a claim for brotherhood, he asked. I would say that it is not a claim or a demand because it is not in the realm of our choices or our free will. It is in the realm of necessity. It is about what I am compelled to do. This is hospitality. This is teranga. This is transnational family. This could be universal. Thank you.
Okay. I was taking some instruction to see how we are going to proceed. And I would like to thank Ali. I'm a little bit guilty, but I knew that when you embark into microhistory, you take a risk, the risk of crying. But crying is good. It's why I like Senghor. I prefer emotion to reason. So what we are going to do is to give Bachir a chance to engage with everything which was presented. It's a lot, but we'll have a break following his intervention and come back for a discussion. Souleymane.
I do understand the crying part of this celebration. Indeed, indeed. Well, I'll start this time with Pierre and the old friendship of ours, you know, seeing each other with, during these many decades that we have known each other. I mean, this is just amazing for me to have, I said it yesterday, all these different periods of my life coming together. And I could see you in your office when I first met you in the US, after we met in Paris for a long time, and you walking me around Columbia. That was my second discovery of Columbia after I was at Harvard. So thank you very much for that long-time friendship, and I thank God for that friendship with many of you. Of course, Mamadou said it all, what we share. We are relatives with him directly, and I understand what it means to be marrying a Saint-Louisienne, because Mamadou just did that, and his wife, who was my cousin, was a saint, one of the saints I've known in my life. Anais, you reminded me the reason why, and I think it is something I can say for all of us who are professors. The reason why we choose to be professors instead of following the path to become billionaires and presidents. It is because we want to stay students. We fell in love with our life as students, just learning every single day something new, and we want to continue to do that. And of course, you offered me the blessing of coming to me with a topic on which I was totally ignorant. And I am very happy I said yes, because I saw the opportunity to learn something, and you have taught me so much. As my students who have graced me with their trust, asking me to supervise their dissertation have done. I have learned so much, and learning about anitude made me understand better what I was trying to do working on gritude. And I understood, for example, reading your dissertation, working closely with you, what our good friend Gayatri Spivak calls strategic essentialism. Negritude or oceanitude are probably the best manifestation of what she called strategic essentialism. So thank you so much for everything I have learned from you. And I have had the good fortune of traveling to Tahiti and spending some time with your mother as well. And you send her my best, and I congratulate her for being soon, for the second time, a grandmother, inshallah. And you mentioned something about the désir de monde, in fact, which is a definition, a good definition of mondialité and of what a university is. I'm very happy, Yala, that you ended your presentation talking about the significance of university for me, and I'm sure for all of us. University, I think it is comparable to airports. They are always from elsewhere. When I'm in an airport, I'm already gone. I'm between countries. And airports, all of them look like they look the same in a way. And when you think that you are gathered with many people at one point, you are finding yourself, all of you in Heathrow, for example, and you understand that in the next hour, you will be on flights going all over the world. It is fascinating. This is just as fascinating a thought as looking at a telescope and looking at the immensity of the universe. And university is that, a sense of mondiality as defined by Christiane Taubira. Christiane Taubira has the best translation of what Edouard Glissant says about mondiality. She says that it has to do mainly with the desire of a word, with the desire of our planet becoming a word or a home or a transnational home, as Ali just said. And about traduire et décoloniser, acolonial, I'll think I'll probably adopt that. I'll ask permission first from Benedict Savoy, because as you know, I am the president of her fans club. So I'll run it by her first, and then I will see if I adopt that. But you're absolutely right about, and it's interesting. Let me say a couple of words about my relationship to the work, the immense work of Cheikh Anta Diop. I've been visiting with our good friend Alisa Lagama, an alumna of our own place, who is the head of at the Metropolitan Museum of the African Oceanian Asian, what used to be called primitive art, or art premier now. And she organized a beautiful exhibition on the African origins of civilization, Cheikh Anta Diop's work. And what she did was pair Egyptian objects, sculptures, with African objects, making them have a conversation, talk to each other. And it worked very beautifully. And this was the best deconstruction of Hegelianism. As you know, Hegel's philosophy basically gives to classical museums their configuration. Hegel thought that, okay, Africa is absolutely worthless, wrapped in the dark mantle of the night, as he puts it. But Egypt was very crucial for him. So Egypt, if you go to classical museums, they always have Egyptian, because he says, Hegel wrote that Egypt was somehow the down. You could feel the spirit coming to life. But then the spirit had to go from east to west, and that is the movement that is followed by all museums when you have Egyptian art, and then you have Greco-Roman art, and then Baroque, and then et cetera, et cetera. So when you put in so-called primitive art, it is sort of troubling the museum and the narrative of universalism. And this is what interested me actually when I recently gave these lectures at the Louvre. I was blessed to have been selected this past year to give those lectures, and hopefully this is becoming a book. So I was very interested in what you said. And what Alisa did with the work of Cheikh Anta Diop, which was really shown in its light as a work of translation. And without knowing about that exhibition, you let me know if I'm wrong, somehow you reproduce that. This is the most intelligent reading of Cheikh Anta Diop that we could have. We are not reading him intelligently otherwise, especially in my own country in Senegal, because we just deify him in a way that is not reading him in an intelligent way, and missing the importance of what he did, and you just revived him. I would think that since now it is the time for censorship, we can censor thinking, I would propose that we decide that Senegalese are not going to write anymore on Cheikh Anta Diop, and we will just ask people from outside to say intelligent things about him. In particular, there are a tiny little group of people who always think that they should present me as the Senghorian, occidentalized elite manifestation, the cosmopolitan, but in the sense that, okay, well, why? If you call yourself a citizen of the world, it is because you have the right type of visa or green card and enough money to take planes. What about those who are trapped in the country, who cannot go elsewhere? But yeah, that is what it is also, to be a cosmopolitan, to fight for the right of everybody to travel everywhere and understand this saying of the Baha'i faith that I respect so much: the earth is one single country, and everybody is the citizen of that earth. So thank you for giving me that opportunity of saying that, and thank you for reminding me that our first meeting was around your dissertation, and you wrote a wonderful book, because it became a book, on Bergson and L'Humanité Créatrice, and I have learned a lot from that. So thank you very much. Nasrin. Ravissante Nasrin, as I call you. Nasrin, Anai and Yala, I could say that I was their mentor, because I was on their dissertation as a supervisor and a second reader with my good friend Frédéric Worms and wonderful Bergsonian scholar Guilain Waterloo as well. Nasrin, I claim her as my mentee as well, and we mentored each other. And Nasrin, I associate always Nasrin with walking, because we were péripatéticiens colleagues. I'm happy that being a male and you a female, and French still saying that le masculin l'emporte, I can say we are péripatéticiens and not péripatéticiennes, because it would mean something else, as you know. But yes, as péripatéticiens, you and I were walking around Chicago. We have walked a lot around Chicago, and all our scholarly exchanges have been while working in the streets of Chicago. And you introduced me to Chicago, and you were one of the reasons, the main reason why I did cry when I was packing to come to Colombia. I will cry, of course, when I pack in the other direction, except that I'm not going anywhere. So no packing, I'll still stick around. And I'm glad that you mentioned the concept of mutant that I used for these African objects, artifacts that find themselves in museums in the North. This is, again, some kind of conversation Mamadou, myself, and Alisa at the Metropolitan Museum have had. It is important to use concepts like that, to understand that, and I'm happy to say that in the presence of Felwine and Benedict, to whom we owe so much about thinking about restitution and these African artifacts as well. It is very important to understand that Odyssey never ends. When Ulysses, or Odysseus, went back to Ithaca, he did not stay. He continued. He had become a mutant. A mutant object is an object that speaks many languages. You have never ended understanding the language that they speak. If you flatten these objects on their kind of identity, on their terroir, you are just betraying them. And they are an excellent metaphor for what it means to be a human. To be a human is to be a mutant. And mutant is a present participle in French. It doesn't just mean that you have changed form. It means that you are a force of changing form in a kind of permanent and open-ended way. And this is how I understand, yes, Ubuntu. And this is how I would understand as well the teranga that you so beautifully, my dear Ali, my dear brother Ali, constructed as a philosophical concept. I have on my plate, on my agenda, the writing of a book on hospitality. And you just gave me actually the entry to writing that. Because we present ourselves as the country of teranga. And as you know, our teams, football teams, basketball teams, are called the Lions of Teranga, which could seem oxymoronic. Some Senegalese are saying, let's not call ourselves Teranga because we would be losing. Let's just remain lions, roaring lions, or something like that, just like Colombia, because here at Columbia, we are roaring lions, and our anthem is roar, lions, roar, when we go to basketball games. We did very well basketball. The women did very well, okay? We went to the playoff for the first time. This needs to be said as a way of celebrating my retirement, because they waited for this year to start winning. But it is important to construct philosophically this concept, and that is what African philosophy is about. African philosophy is not just saying, well, we also have philosophy and world of moral, this, just the patient, precise work on concepts. That is what philosophy does, and that is what Deleuze said. La philosophie, c'est la construction de concept. So you take banal words from the language and you turn them into operating, useful concepts, and teranga needs to be done. It needs to be done for teranga in that way, and the rapprochement you make with Ubuntu. You know, and you mentioned politics of teranga. Someone who did politics of teranga, and here I'm going to shock Salim, was President Léopold Sédar Senghor. He would say all his addresses to the Senegalese nation this way: Sénégalaises, Sénégalais, hôtes étrangers qui vivaient parmi nous. We were the only country in the world where the president's address would talk about the Senegalese women, the Senegalese men, and the guests among us. Unfortunately, we lost that. Because, of course, if you are succeeding Senghor and speaking like him, it would sound strange. It is unfortunate that Abdou Diouf did not do it. Macky Sall did it once or a couple of times. Macky Sall stopped it. We should write in the Constitution, we should have an amendment saying that every single official would say Sénégalaises, Sénégalais, hôtes étrangers qui vivaient parmi nous. And it is not just the formula. And this is something I'm going to connect again to what Nasrin said about Camara Laye. Camara Laye, Djibril Tamsir Niane, many great Guinean intellectuals, many great Haitian intellectuals, many great intellectuals from all over Africa found home in Senegal because of Senghor's politics of teranga. He thought that this country owed it to itself to have these come in Senegal and become Senegalese civil servants. All these Haitian poets who had to run from the regime of Duvalier overnight would become Senegalese citizens. And you mentioned the relationship with Morocco and the teranga that we share. Senghor and Hassan II designed a relationship which is very special between the two. You have to treat a Senegalese in Morocco just like a Moroccan, and the other way around as well. And this is why traveling to Morocco, we do not need a visa, and vice versa. And even when Senegal raised the fees for foreign students in our universities, I hated that for the reasons that I have explained. It was prohibited to raise it for Moroccans because you would go against that special relationship that we had. And the reason why I'm mentioning all these intellectuals becoming Senegalese, because teranga was the politics of Senghor, because of Camara Laye. I met Camara Laye when I was very, very young, because he was a friend of my uncle, Pate, and my uncle Pate Diagne brought him home once to have taste the cuisine of our mother. And this is when I met Camara Laye. And speaking of cuisine, Ali is a great cook. Nasrin is a wonderful chef. And when we ended walking around Chicago, we would go and eat something that is called heavenly mud. La bout du ciel. She does a great bout du ciel. And another chef, great chef, is Daniel. Daniel is also, and you are. He got it from his father. You'll see how this is a family matter for me, this celebration, my dear Emmanuel. So I will end on the philosophical construction of teranga. And actually, I was reminded, because we talked about fraternity or brotherhood yesterday, I realized that one way of claiming fraternity, and I correct myself, I say that you can claim, demand liberty, you can demand equality. You could not demand fraternity. Yes, you could. What's the name of this Democrat who was so close to the Republican and who ran for president, Joseph Lieberman. Joseph Lieberman. Joseph Lieberman, I remember once going to, I think he went to a Muslim gathering. He was looking for votes. And he presented himself saying, I am your brother Joseph, playing on his own name. Because the Bible and the Quran say that when Joseph showed to his brothers that he was their brother Joseph, he was claiming, you have to treat me like your brother. So this is a form of demand that you can have on teranga. You can say, I deserve your teranga, I'm demanding your teranga, and that is the force of the philosophy of Emmanuel Levinas. The other who comes commends you. The face of the other, the visage de l'autre, is actually commending that you consider them your brother. So I'm very happy that you gave me the opportunity of correcting myself about claiming fraternity. Indeed, we can claim that. So I claim your fraternity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bashir. We have some time for questions and comment. But before that, I would just like to add something in this discussion between Bashir and Salim about Senghor and his contradiction. Senegal is the only country in Africa where the status of a university underlined that any African is allowed to actually compete for a position. Senegal recruits not based on nationality, based on a continental idea, and this is also one of the Senghor's legacy.
Okay, I think. It does.
Yeah.
Okay. I think we should correct actually what you just said because it shines and further better, because now everyone from everywhere can compete to be a professor at Senegalese universities. So it's Senegalese universities are universal. And that's one of the only positive changes in Senegal recently. I had a question for Nasrin. I was thinking during your talk of the figure of Sogolon as a saver of empire and an imperfect saver of empire, and the ugliness of Sogolon can it be read as the ugliness of politics? Because politics is necessarily messy and is always the contrary of perfection. And all these kings and like handsome hunters and all these guys, they are perfect. And Sogolon, as well as Sunjata, need to create the first republic, which necessarily is negotiated and can't be as perfect as imposing an order.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think so. The figure of Sogolon. So I'm trying to read Sogolon not less as kind of the ugly, beautiful, and valorize the beautiful and downtrod the ugly, but rather kind of think about it in terms of the problem of balance and imbalance, and the way that. So I began thinking about the work. It's the story. The story itself works on this kind of imbalance. You know, things are always trying to fall into imbalance, and then somehow they get balanced out. And so this also is then a secondary reflection is on the political, you know, so because this is also the foundation of an empire and how an empire gets formed and the problem of balance and imbalance in that sense. Absolutely. So so that's why I wanted to say that the formal aspect of the novel is also a reflection then on the political gestures of the novel, if that makes sense. Yeah.
Over questions? I have a question to Nasrin also regarding Kamara Laye. And I think that Bachir will agree with me. We have been educated actually against Kamara Laye. He was considered as the very conservative West African writer of the 50s. And he was always compared, for example, to Sembène. And one thing strange which happened to me is why I went back to read him. I bought a translation of Le Regard du Roi, The Radiance of the King. And I began reading at Book Culture, and I sat there, and I read this preface, which was a preface by Toni Morrison. And she was saying, this is the greatest book ever written by an African. I say, probably she was drunk. Something is not working. So I sat there and I read it, and I reread it. And she said something, and this is my question. You took Les gens de la parole, which is a kind of classic, very traditional book. But when you read carefully Le Regard du Roi, Kamara Laye is writing an anti-anthropological book. He's subverting. It's no longer this European traveling. First, this European is naked, and everybody is laughing after him. The second thing is that he is revealed by, by the gaze of the king. But how do you compare the two? How does it fit in what Bachir is telling us about precisely art, about aesthetic, and about the universal?
Yes. Well, I'm so glad you asked me about Le Regard du Roi, because I love Le Regard du Roi. I think it's one of the most phenomenal works of literature ever written anywhere. And it's true that since when the second English translation came out in 2002, I know a lot about it because I'm trying to write the chapter in my book on chance, because I'm reading that novel through the figure of chance and hasard. And because at the beginning of the novel, the character Clarence has just lost everything at gambling. And so I'm trying to kind of read it through that figure and how it comes through the novel. It's rather difficult. It's taking me some time. But that novel has an interesting history, right? So most of us might be familiar with it. The whole accusations of plagiarism, that Kamara Laye didn't write the novel. And a lot of it came out after the 2002 preface by, because it was with Adel King's investigative publication of, it's called Reading Kamara Laye, where there was all this investigation done about who wrote Le Regard du Roi. And one of the elements about it is that Kamara Laye style is not consistent. Right, so that style is very different from L'Enfant Noir, and it's also different from Dramous and Le Maître de la Parole. And this idea is, it's provocative because it asks us the question of what is an author, as Foucault asked us, right? What is it? There has to be consistency of style. We have to recognize there's a kind of coherence. So all of these things are at work. And so the readings of the novel, I think, kind of got completely caught up in that scandal afterwards, and people never went back to the novel to read it. So, so in a way, I'm making this Herculean effort. But I think if you really carefully read Camara Laye's, all of his work, despite all the differences in style, people are around to write differently, you can see there's a consistency in manner of writing. So his use of perhaps, for example, across his work, he has a very particular use of the word perhaps, peut-être. The way he mobilizes free and direct style. His humor, Camara Laye is hilarious across his oeuvre, but nobody really wants to talk about his humor because everybody's kind of talking about the colonial, the pre-colonial, the response to the West, and all of this. And in fact, the reason why I associate Bachir with Camara Laye is because of their humor. They both have this mischievous humor about them. So I do see the differences in style, to come back to your question, but I also see, if you really get into the granular work, there's a consistent thought on aesthetic. Le Regard Leroy is a lot about aesthetic, is about all the clothing, that suit that falls apart, then the boo-boo and all the discussion about the color of the boo-boo and the pattern of the boo-boo, and then it finishes with the king's great mantle. So there's a lot of work on aesthetic, about form, that runs through his work. So I actually see quite a lot of continuity across his oeuvre, if that answers your question.
Felwin, I will give you the floor after.
Yes, thank you very much for your beautiful presentation. I want to ask a question to Anaïs. I was very interested in the notion of raison fusion beyond raison étreinte, and I just want you to, if you can elaborate more about the epistemological consequences of raison fusion, and I find it very, very interesting, this idea.
Thank you. This is a proposal that I'm suggesting to continue reading gritude texts in an eco-critical manner, but it's rooted in a pan-Pacific epistemological tradition. Pacific studies officially are dated back to a foundational book by Epeliha Ofa entitled "We Are the Ocean." And this title is not read as a metaphor. It's read as a historical, genealogical, and epistemological assertion of the fusional link between Pacific people and the Pacific Ocean, which is exemplified in the novel I briefly mentioned by Paul Tavot, not only because of nuclear colonialism, but also because of climate change. The overdeveloped nations of the world are pouring CO2 into the Pacific Ocean. About 90% of CO2 doesn't go in the atmosphere, it goes in the ocean. And the pouring of CO2 in the ocean results in what is described in Pacific Rim countries as a pouring of Pacific refugees. So you have the same form of fusional relationship, because what you do to the world, you do to the humans inhabiting the world, and vice versa. This is not a metaphor because, as I also mentioned briefly, in the Pacific people, in most Pacific countries, it's very hard to generalize because it's an area of the world that covers half of the planet. But in most Pacific countries, humans came to being through procreation, and through procreation between the ocean and the skies, or between the land and the sky. For example, in Polynesia, it's the procreation between Papatuanuku and Ranginui that created humans. So it's a genealogical link between the places that sustain us and humanity that is to be taken very literally. So I'm not sure that reason fusion is exactly the right word to describe it. There's many metaphors in Pacific philosophy and literature. Luc Camoui talks about l'humanité océanique. Teresia Tiawa writes in a more poetic form, we know that the ocean is in us because we sweat and cry salt water. I could go on and on with the metaphors, but there's really this ongoing leitmotif from Hawaii to Aotearoa, New Zealand, to Rapa Nui, Easter Island, again, an area covering half of the planet, this ongoing leitmotif, thousands of miles apart. The thinkers from these islands reassert a fusional relationship with the ocean and with the islands, which are understood in continuity.
Thank you very much. I will give Ali a chance to respond very quickly. And I will take the two last questions, here and here. Ali.
Thank you. I just want to ask Bachir to translate what I just received from my cousin who is from Saint Louis and Fez as well. She sent this audio. I hope.
Fez ak Saint Louis ñoom seex nañu Fez ak Saint Louis seex nañu ni ñu nekkee seex nag moom veut dire beaucoup de choses pour lien yi nga xam ni moom lien yi nga xam ni ñoo leen dajale daal foor na torop moo tax Fez ak Saint Louis moom ñoom mag ak rakk nañu ñoom ñoo bokk ndey ak baay alhamdulillah.
What did she say? Well, she said beautifully that the city of Saint Louis and the city of Fez are twin cities, and she added to make sure that we are not understanding twin cities the diplomatic way. They have the same father and the same mother, and you cannot separate them. Which is, by the way, so true that in many cities in Senegal, you have neighborhoods called Fas, and there is also a village now, a small city called Fas. Yes. Say hi to her.
Yeah. Thank you.
There's a question for Ali and Yala, and I was thinking of Yala's very helpful reminder that hospitality, the other day, that hospitality can presuppose a model of the family. And I wanted to ask Ali and Yala whether they saw room for dialogue between themselves about that question, since Ali, in a way, was reminding us also that we might not want to presuppose what the family is that's presupposed by hospitality, but think about the open-endedness and all the things that family can become, and perhaps the way that family will change what hospitality is and hospitality will change what family is. So whether there's dialogue there between you.
Thank you. Ali.
Thank you, Penelope. I just want to emphasize this notion of home, because what I try to say is that when you belong to a home, it is really what we will be called a country. So you can have, I try to say that you have the same home, but part of it is in Fez, part of it is in Saint Louis. And the sign of it is that the children could be born in Fez and grown up in Saint Louis, and in Saint Louis born in Saint Louis and grown up in Fez. That means that you have to shape a new category of home, which is not related to nuclear family, and which has to take into account these features of transnational relationships. And this is, of course, hospitality. And by the way, also something else, is it that when you, and I saw that in my family, when my sister was left in Fez when my parents was in Senegal, she grows with the sister, our aunt, the sister of my mother, and of course she was the sisters of the others. And so then when you grow up in this kind of situation, this kind of atmosphere, you, of course, you are attached to your mother, biological mother, but you have also a broadened idea of a family that comes to you in the very early step of your life.
Thank you, Ali.
Can I just answer? I think I cannot answer. It's really difficult, but I really have, I like this notion of home, but to me, it's a really complicated notion. And I really read it through a lot of Black thinkers from the beginning of the 20th century to today. And I have two names, Saidiya Hartman, of course, in Lose Your Mother. She always think about this impossibility of longing for home. And race is about that, the fact that we have no home. And in fact, it's also really interesting because there is an author that I love, and I made a lecture also for Bachir Diagne, but I changed a little after that. But there is an author that is really conservative in the Black movement, but that is also really interesting to understand what is hospitality. This is Marcus Garvey, really. And he has this idea that belonging to the Black race and is being African, and that Africa is the home for all the Black people. You know, this is the term of the diaspora. Belonging to a diaspora means that you are far away from your home and that you want to find it. And to me, it's a complete, okay, I'm going to be quite provocative. It's a kind of illusion for many reasons. So I have a lot of problems with the notions of home, with those notions of hospitality too. And the fact, when I understand what I want, for example, politically, is to be able to live with people that are not my brothers and not my sisters without killing them. That's all really what I want to think about. And I know we also have to think about the fact that a lot of people on this earth are homeless. So where do they have to live? So this is why I am very in this complicated. I have problems with all those notions of brotherhood, sisterhood, home, etc. Because I don't know what to expect from them politically.
But I think that it's a very important question. Bachir is forcing us to revisit. Again, to just referring to Brent, who is here. One of the most challenging discussions about home is Toni Morrison. Usually people, they know the novel Home, but she has a short piece in a book which was celebrating the 25th anniversary of the publication, of the release of Cornel West, Race Matters. And she makes this distinction between habitation, home, and house. Trying to understand how it's related to race. And precisely why home is important is where you build a narrative. And that narrative could be the produce of the political economic condition. Is why she's very different from Saidiya Hartman. Because she said that this is the only way that you can project yourself in the future, is to understand that racism has built the culture of the Black subaltern, and you cannot leave it behind. And that connection becomes important. But again, Bachir is telling us how do we think about that. And I think we have to take seriously that question. So last intervention. He left.
Okay, go ahead, but we have to go in like.
Yeah, very, very quickly.
Very briefly, thank you.
So my my question actually was for Nasrin. You mentioned this idea of coupe coupé, which in the novel of Camara Laye, that you mentioned this idea of slashing the throat. Yes, the Queen Mother, right, whose throat gets slashed, or who's threatened to be. He's play acting. Okay, so her throat is never slashed. Okay, so that was really reminding me of the idea of that you started with describing Bashir's literary posture as kind of a humorous one, and it made me think a lot of irony. And then my second question actually was for Yala, which is about this question of translation. If translation can be the antidote to epistemic alienation. I think what you just described of being in a place where you are trying to prevent yourself from killing those around you or don't want to be killed by those around you is a form of epistemic alienation. Do you either could respond to this thing?
Okay, thank you. So very quickly, Nasrin and Yala.
The idea is that how to get this woman to, because the whole aim is to get this emperor to be born, conceived and be born, and so the idea is how to do it, and so the king comes up with a ruse, and the ruse is to make her lower her ability to use her powers. So when he terrorizes her, she's so terrified that she surrenders, and so that's how the child is conceived. And so this is, one can say a lot about that situation, but that's basic. In different versions, tell that story a little bit differently. But this is Camara Laye's way of telling that part of the story. So there's no actually slashing of the throat, but yet there is terror, right? So the shift, what I was trying to say, that the shift that's usually associated with the ugly is shifted onto the beautiful, right? So in that kind of so there's Camara Laye is making a gesture, like a political gesture, that onto a different kind of question, which is we can talk about much more.
Thank you.